The first mistake. Introduction. Some things in life can't be undone. The moment you invite the darkness in, it begins to change you. Derek thought he had found the answer, but what he didn't know was that some solutions come with a price too high to pay. Derek had always struggled with sleep. It wasn't the usual kind of restlessness that most people experienced. No, his struggle was something far deeper. Every night, the darkness closed in on him as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through memories he couldn't escape. The anxiety that gripped his chest made it impossible to breathe deeply, and the silence of the night only made it worse. He had tried everything: meditation, sleeping pills, even hypnosis. But nothing worked. No matter how hard he tried, sleep always seemed just out of reach, like a distant dream he could never quite grasp. The exhaustion was starting to show in his eyes. His body craved rest, but his mind refused to let him go. One night, while scrolling through his phone, Derek came across an ad that caught his attention. The headline read, "Say goodbye to sleepless nights. The sleep spray that will change everything." The ad seemed too good to be true, but Derek was desperate. He read through the testimonials of people who claimed to have found the perfect solution for their sleep problems. They spoke of deep, peaceful slumber, with no interruptions. It was all so perfect, so tempting. Without a second thought, Derek clicked on the link. The website was simple, with clean lines and soothing colors. It felt almost too comforting, like a lullaby in digital form. The spray was marketed as a natural, non-habit-forming solution that would transform the way you slept. The reviews were overwhelmingly positive, and Derek's skepticism began to fade. Maybe this was the answer he had been searching for. He ordered the product, and within days, a small, unmarked package arrived at his door. The label read only, "Sleep spray for your peace." There was no mention of where it came from or who had made it. The mystery only intrigued him more. That night, after a long and exhausting day, Derek couldn't wait to try it. He was tired, emotionally drained, and all he wanted was to fall asleep without the usual nightmares. He sprayed the mist on his pillow, inhaling the soothing scent. It was a delicate fragrance, a mix of lavender, chamomile, and something else, something that lingered in the air, a touch of something darker, perhaps even sinister. The moment his head hit the pillow, he felt a wave of relief. His eyes fluttered closed, and for a moment, he thought this would finally be the night he would sleep without struggle. But the peacefulness didn't last long. It was as though the very air around him had changed. The room seemed darker, the shadows longer. His breathing became shallow, and his heartbeat quickened. Derek tried to shake it off, blaming his own exhaustion. He had read about how strong scents could sometimes trigger unusual sensations, but this felt different. His body began to tremble involuntarily. There was an overwhelming sense of being watched, of being not alone. He turned over in bed, trying to ignore the unease settling deep in his chest. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with every passing second. Suddenly, a cold draft swept across the room, even though the windows were closed. His skin prickled, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Derek sat up in bed, his heart pounding in his chest. His eyes scanned the dark corners of the room. Nothing. No movement. But the whispers, faint and distant, were they real? He shook his head, trying to dismiss it. It must have been the spray, the effects of the scent, playing tricks on his mind. But the room felt alive, like something ancient and malevolent was waiting for him to fall asleep, to fully surrender. He closed his eyes, willing himself to sleep, but the fear wouldn't leave him. The minutes stretched into hours. Derek's thoughts raced. He tried to remember the reviews, the glowing words of others who had claimed the spray had worked wonders for them. Why wasn't it working for him? Why did everything feel so wrong? Then it happened. A voice, soft and insistent, whispered from the darkness. It was so faint at first that Derek thought it was just his imagination. "Sleep, Derek. Let it take you." His heart skipped a beat. He shot up in bed, gasping for air. Sweat drenched his body. His eyes scanned the room frantically, but everything was still. The shadows were still shadows, and the silence was almost deafening. But the voice had been real, or at least it felt real. "Just a dream," Derek muttered to himself, trying to calm down. But deep inside, something told him it was more than that. Something was happening to him, something he didn't understand. He reached for the bottle of sleep spray, still sitting on his nightstand. The label glowed softly in the dark, as though calling to him. Derek hesitated for a moment. Could it be the spray? Could it be that it was affecting him in ways he didn't comprehend? He spritzed a little more on his pillow, hoping it would calm his mind. But the moment the mist touched the fabric, the shadows in the room seemed to shift. The darkness seemed to grow, to stretch, as if reaching for him. The cold air in the room turned icy, and Derek's breath came out in visible puffs. He felt a weight on his chest, as though invisible hands were pressing down, holding him in place. And then the whispers began again. This time they were louder, clearer. "Sleep, Derek, fall into the dark. You have no choice, sleep." The voice was not his own. It was cold, distant, and filled with malice. Derek's heart raced, but his eyelids grew heavy. The pull of sleep was irresistible now. His body was exhausted, and the fear, while suffocating, also felt strangely comforting in its own way. It was as if the darkness was calling to him, offering him peace in exchange for something far more valuable. Sleep was here. But at what cost? The darkness inside. The morning came slowly, as if the sun itself was hesitant to break the cold grip of night. Derek woke up, but it wasn't the usual grogginess that greeted him. No, it was something much worse. His body felt heavy, as if the weight of an invisible force had been pressing down on him all night, and now that it had lifted, he was left with the aftermath. He sat up slowly, glancing around the room. Everything looked normal, almost too normal. His room was still, the shadows now retreating into the corners as sunlight began to filter through the curtains. But there was something different, something subtle that Derek couldn't place. His mind felt foggy, as though it wasn't quite his own. The familiar hum of his thoughts was absent. He stood up, walking to the bathroom, and splashed water on his face. The coolness of the water did nothing to clear his mind. It only made him more aware of how strangely detached he felt. He stared into the mirror, his reflection staring back at him with hollow eyes. "What's happening to me?" Derek thought, his hands gripping the edge of the sink. He looked like himself, but something inside him had changed. It was like the sleep spray had unlocked something within him, something he wasn't sure he wanted to confront. As he prepared for the day, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email, one he didn't recognize. The subject line read, "You can't escape it." A chill ran down his spine. Derek opened the email, his fingers trembling. The message was short, but its impact was immediate. "You can't escape what you've awakened. The darkness is inside you now. It won't let you go. You invited it, and it's never leaving." His hands went cold, and the phone slipped from his grasp, hitting the floor with a dull thud. The email was dated just moments ago, yet there was no way it could have been sent while he was asleep. The sender was anonymous, the email address a string of meaningless letters and numbers. Panic began to creep in, his chest tightening. Derek stumbled back into the living room, pacing back and forth, trying to make sense of what was happening. His mind raced as the events of the previous night replayed in his head. The shadows, the whispers, the voice calling him to sleep, it had all felt so real. Was it the spray? Or was it something else? Something he couldn't explain? His phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't an email. It was a message from an unknown number. Derek's fingers hovered over the screen, hesitation clouding his thoughts. But curiosity won over fear, and he opened the message. "You're not alone, Derek. The others are waiting." He dropped the phone, his breath caught in his throat. He wasn't sure what that meant, but deep down, he knew it wasn't a message he was supposed to ignore. The fear that had settled in his chest the night before was now an overwhelming presence, suffocating him. It was the feeling of being trapped, of being stalked by something invisible. He needed answers. He couldn't keep living like this, not knowing what was happening, not understanding the consequences of his actions. He grabbed his jacket and rushed out the door, the cool air hitting his face like a slap. As Derek walked down the street, the normalcy of the world around him felt like a sick joke. People went about their lives, unaware of the unseen horrors that were beginning to consume him. He felt the weight of their indifference, like they were in a different world, a world he no longer belonged to. It wasn't long before Derek arrived at a small, quiet cafe, a place he often went to clear his mind. He sat down at a corner table, his hands shaking as he reached for his coffee. The warmth did little to calm the ice in his veins. His phone buzzed again, pulling his attention back to the screen. Another message. This one was different, more personal. "Derek, we know what you've done. You used the spray, didn't you? We warned you. It's already inside you, feeding off your fear. It wants you to give in." Derek felt his stomach churn. He slammed the phone down on the table, his mind spiraling. The weight of the words hung in the air like a suffocating fog. How could they know? How could they understand? He wasn't imagining it. It was all real. The whispers, the shadows, the email, it was all connected. Suddenly, the cafe felt too small, too confined. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the shadows in the corners of the room began to shift again. Derek looked around frantically, but no one seemed to notice. They were all too absorbed in their own little worlds, too comfortable in their own lives to notice the creeping darkness that was closing in on him. As he stood up, trying to shake off the overwhelming sensation, the door to the cafe slammed open. A figure stepped inside, their face hidden in the shadow of a hood. Derek froze, his heart racing. The figure didn't look at anyone else, didn't make a sound. They walked straight toward him. Derek's breath caught in his throat as the figure stopped in front of him. The hooded stranger looked down at him, their face still obscured by the darkness. Derek's pulse raced, and for a moment he couldn't move. The silence was deafening. Then the figure spoke, their voice low and cold. "You can't hide from it forever. It's already inside you, and it's waiting for you to fall asleep again." Derek's eyes widened in terror. The stranger turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Derek standing there, paralyzed with fear. The deeper darkness. Derek couldn't shake the voice of the mysterious stranger from his mind. It echoed in his thoughts, a chilling reminder of the haunting truth he could no longer deny. The darkness had already taken root inside him, and now, it seemed, there was no escape. The afternoon passed in a haze. Derek tried to go through the motions of a normal day, but it felt like he was walking through a dream. Every corner he turned, every sound he heard, seemed distorted, like the world around him was slowly unraveling. His reflection in windows no longer looked like him. There was something off. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, as if he were a stranger trapped in his own body. Derek reached out to his closest friends, hoping they would offer some comfort, some reassurance. But as the phone rang, a growing sense of dread gnawed at him. No one picked up. Not one person responded to his messages. It was as though they were all avoiding him, shutting him out. The weight of isolation settled heavily on his shoulders. He tried to convince himself it was just coincidence, that they were busy, that something had come up, but deep down he knew the truth. The darkness was pulling him further away from the world. He was alone. That night, Derek found himself back in his apartment, pacing back and forth. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of his desk, trying to steady himself. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch longer, twisting in unnatural ways. The air felt thick, oppressive. It was like the very walls of his apartment were closing in on him. Then the phone buzzed again. This time it was an email. But it wasn't the usual anonymous message. It was from someone Derek knew. Someone he hadn't heard from in years, Emily. She had been his childhood friend, the one person who had always been there for him. The one person who understood him before everything changed. The subject line read, "Get out." Derek's heart stopped for a moment as he opened the message. His fingers moved slowly, almost unwillingly, but he had to know what it said. The message was short, but it hit him like a punch to the gut. "Derek, you have to get out. The spray. It's worse than you think. You've opened a door, and now it's too late. The shadows are watching you. Don't sleep. Don't close your eyes. It will come for you. Please leave. Before it's too late." His breath caught in his throat. What did she mean by that? How could she know? And why was she warning him now? He stared at the screen, his thoughts a blur, before quickly typing a reply. "What do you mean? Emily, what's going on?" But before he could hit send, the phone screen flickered, then went black. Panic surged through Derek as he tried to turn the phone back on. Nothing. It wouldn't respond. He was left in complete silence, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. His mind raced, spiraling out of control. He had to get out. But where would he go? He couldn't escape what had already latched onto him. The darkness was inside him now. It would follow him no matter where he went. Desperation clawed at his chest. He grabbed his coat and rushed out the door. His feet hit the pavement, the cold air stinging his face. His heart was pounding in his chest, each beat a reminder of the fear that gripped him. As Derek walked, he tried to make sense of everything. The spray. The shadows. The mysterious messages. Emily's warning. None of it made sense. But deep down, he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was coming. Something he couldn't outrun. He didn't know how much longer he could keep running from it. Suddenly, the street seemed too quiet. Too empty. The sounds of the city, the distant hum of traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, had all faded away. Derek stopped, his eyes scanning the darkened streets. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He wasn't alone. A figure appeared in the distance, walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. Derek's pulse quickened. The figure was hooded, their face hidden in shadow. It was the same figure he had seen earlier, the one who had warned him. The same person who had spoken those chilling words in the cafe. But this time, there was no mistaking it. The figure was closer now, close enough for Derek to see the faint outline of a face beneath the hood. It was pale, almost sickly, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through him. "You shouldn't have come back, Derek," the figure whispered, their voice low and cold, like ice scraping against metal. "You woke it up. Now you belong to it." Derek's heart pounded in his ears as the figure stepped closer, their presence consuming him. He wanted to run, to scream, but his body refused to move. The fear was paralyzing, suffocating him. The figure's hands reached out, their fingers long and twisted, like the claws of some predatory creature. Derek's breath caught in his throat as the figure's cold touch brushed against his skin. It was like a jolt of electricity, sending waves of terror through his body. "Sleep, Derek. It's time for you to sleep." The words echoed in his mind, a command he couldn't escape. He stumbled back, trying to break free, but the darkness was closing in. It wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside him, crawling through his veins, twisting his thoughts. He could feel it, the pull of sleep. The desire to give in, to let go of the fear and the confusion. It was like a siren's call, luring him into its depths. The figure was waiting, watching, as Derek's eyelids grew heavy. And just before the darkness took him, Derek realized the terrible truth. There was no escaping it. The abyss. Derek's eyelids fluttered, his body fighting against the overwhelming urge to succumb to the darkness that had been chasing him. His thoughts felt foggy, distant, like he was drifting in a sea of shadows. The streets around him seemed to fade into nothingness as the figure's presence loomed, suffocating every breath he took. He tried to speak, to scream, but the words caught in his throat. His mouth felt dry, his body weak. Every inch of him screamed to wake up, to break free, but the weight of the unknown force pressing down on him was too powerful. "Let go," the figure whispered again, its voice dripping with malevolence. "Sleep. It's the only way." With every passing second, Derek's grip on reality loosened. The city around him was gone now. He was alone in a vast, empty space, surrounded by nothing but darkness. No sounds, no light, no escape. It felt like he was being swallowed whole by an abyss, a place where time had no meaning. Suddenly, a cold rush of air cut through the silence, as if someone had opened a door into another world. Derek's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing there. Just the oppressive darkness. He was trapped in a void, unable to escape, unable to even think clearly. A faint light flickered in the distance. It was a small, weak glow, but it was there, flickering like a candle in the wind. Derek's heart surged with hope. Maybe there was a way out. Maybe that light was the escape he so desperately needed. But as he stumbled toward it, the darkness seemed to pull at him more fiercely. His feet felt like they were sinking into the ground, as if the very earth beneath him was trying to drag him down into its depths. Panic set in. He couldn't stop. He couldn't breathe. His body was heavy, unwilling to cooperate. With every step, the light seemed to grow further away, until it was no longer visible at all. It was as though it had never existed in the first place, a cruel trick played on him by his own mind. Derek collapsed to his knees, the weight of the darkness crushing him. Tears streamed down his face, but he couldn't feel them, only the suffocating sensation of being consumed by the void. The figure loomed over him once more, its hooded face now inches from his own. The cold breath of its whisper sent chills down his spine. "You are already here, Derek. You've been here all along." The words hit him like a slap to the face. What did it mean? Here. What did it want from him? Before he could process the meaning, the ground beneath him began to tremble, a low, guttural rumble vibrating through the air. The darkness seemed to pulse, alive and hungry, closing in from all sides. Derek's chest tightened with fear, his breath shallow and erratic. Then a sound, loud and terrifying, echoed through the void. It was a scream, a cry of agony and terror. The scream reverberated through the darkness, a soul-piercing cry that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the void. It wasn't his scream, yet Derek felt it in every fiber of his being. The sound was haunting, agonizing, as if someone was being torn apart, body and soul. It was a sound he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. It was inside him now, burrowing deep into his mind. He gasped, trying to regain control, but the more he tried, the harder it became to breathe. The pressure on his chest was suffocating, and the shadows were closing in on him, drowning out everything else. His heart raced, each beat echoing in his ears like a ticking clock, counting down to something he couldn't understand. The figure reached out to him again, its long, twisted fingers brushing against his cheek. This time, it didn't feel cold. It felt alive. The touch sent a surge of terror through his veins, as if it were draining the very essence of his being. The figure's eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to pierce into his soul. "You're not who you were," the figure said, its voice like gravel scraping against stone. "Not anymore. You're part of the darkness now. Forever." Derek's body trembled, his mind slipping further into madness. He fought to scream, to move, to escape, but it was no use. His limbs felt paralyzed, locked in place by an unseen force. His mind, once sharp and clear, was now clouded with fear and confusion, racing in circles. "You have two choices," the figure continued, its voice now a low, mocking tone. "You can give in, let go and become one with the darkness. Or you can keep fighting, keep running, but you'll never escape. The darkness always finds its way." The words sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't just a choice between life and death. It was a choice between losing himself completely or enduring an eternity of torment. Derek's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the full weight of what the figure was saying. The darkness wasn't just a force that would consume his body. It was a force that would devour his soul, erase everything that made him him. All the pain, all the fear, all the sorrow he had ever felt, it would become part of the shadows. The very essence of his existence would be wiped away. Tears blurred Derek's vision, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to feel the weight of it all, the hopelessness, the fear, the isolation. He thought of Emily, of his childhood, of the life he had once known. It all seemed so far away now, like a distant memory fading into the void. But then something inside him stirred. A flicker of defiance. A spark of resistance. Derek clenched his fists, feeling the last remnants of his humanity fighting to break free. No, he thought. I'm not done yet. With every ounce of strength he had left, Derek pushed against the darkness. His chest heaved with each breath, the fight inside him intensifying. The shadows clawed at him, trying to pull him back into their grasp, but he refused to give in. He wouldn't be consumed. Not like this. The figure watched him, its twisted face almost amused by his struggle. It leaned closer, its voice now barely a whisper. You can try, it said, but it won't matter. The darkness is stronger than you. But Derek didn't listen. He kept fighting, his will stronger than ever. Slowly, almost painfully, the darkness began to retreat. The shadows that had once surrounded him began to recede, pulling away from his body. The oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he could breathe again. But he wasn't free. As the shadows shrank back, a new fear settled over Derek. There was no escaping the darkness. It was always with him, lurking just beyond the veil, waiting for him to slip. He had only delayed the inevitable. The darkness had touched him, and it would never let him go. The figure was gone now, but Derek knew its influence would linger, haunting him every step of the way. His heart ached with the realization that his battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. As Derek stumbled through the empty streets, the only thing he could hear now was the pounding of his own heart. The world seemed to be holding its breath, as if it, too, were waiting for the darkness to claim him once and for all. The end is near. Derek couldn't tell how much time had passed. The world around him felt unreal, as if it was shifting and warping, trying to trap him in its distorted reality. His legs ached with every step, his body exhausted from the fight he had barely won. But despite the fading light and the desolation surrounding him, a gnawing feeling of dread refused to leave him. The darkness was still there, lurking at the edges of his mind. He paused for a moment, leaning against a crumbling wall for support. The silence around him was deafening, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he felt completely, utterly alone. No footsteps, no voices, just the endless hum of nothingness. He closed his eyes for a brief second, willing himself to believe that this was over. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. It can't be over, he thought. The darkness never truly leaves. And then, as if to prove him right, the ground beneath him trembled. Derek's eyes snapped open, heart racing. The earth seemed to groan in pain, as if something immense and powerful was awakening deep beneath its surface. His stomach churned with fear. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just some hallucination or nightmare. Whatever force was out there wasn't done with him yet. Suddenly, the sky above him shattered. Not in the way that you'd expect. There was no dramatic crash or thunderclap. Instead, the sky fractured like glass, pieces of reality falling away and exposing the dark void behind them. It felt like the fabric of his world was tearing apart. His breath caught in his throat as he realized that the world he knew was disintegrating around him, and there was no escape. He turned and ran, his legs moving on their own as the ground cracked and split beneath him. The streets seemed to twist, pulling him in different directions, as though the very city itself was trying to trap him. But Derek kept running, heart pounding in his chest, the only sound his heavy breaths and the relentless cracking of the world. A figure appeared ahead of him, a tall, looming shadow that seemed to be waiting. Its outline was familiar. He had seen it before. He had heard its voice. Derek's body froze, a cold shiver running down his spine as he realized what was happening. The figure that had chased him, haunted him, was no longer just a presence in his mind. It was here in the flesh, and it was waiting for him. "You've tried so hard to escape," the figure said, its voice smooth and mocking. "But you can't run forever. You belong to me now, Derek. You always have." Derek's hands trembled as he reached out for something, anything, to steady himself. His mind was spinning, his thoughts racing, but it all felt so surreal. How was this possible? How had it come to this? His whole life, his identity, everything was crumbling around him. He wasn't just running from a figure anymore. He was running from his very soul. The figure took a slow step toward him, its movements deliberate, calculated. It was too calm, too certain. Derek could feel its power pressing in on him, suffocating him. He wanted to scream, to fight, but his body felt heavy. Every muscle in his body screamed in pain, his mind struggling to hold on to the last fragments of his sanity. "It's over, Derek," the figure whispered. "You can't fight it. You can't fight me." But Derek's fear sparked something deep within him. He couldn't give in. Not now. Not after everything he had been through. With a final, desperate push, he forced his legs to move, to take another step. His body screamed in protest, but he kept going. The darkness behind him tried to swallow him whole, pulling at his soul, but Derek didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The figure loomed closer, its shadow stretching across the ground like an endless void. It was almost upon him now, the coldness of its presence wrapping around him like chains. And then, in one final, frantic burst of energy, Derek reached forward. His hand found something solid, something real. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The figure hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty in its cold, hollow eyes. For the briefest moment, Derek saw a glimmer of the world he once knew, his childhood, his family, his life before the darkness came. It was fleeting, just a flash, but it gave him the strength he needed. With one final cry, Derek pulled himself free from the figure's grasp, breaking free of the suffocating hold that had kept him prisoner for so long. The ground beneath him cracked one last time, and everything around him began to fade. The darkness, the figure, it was all disappearing. Derek's vision blurred as the world seemed to crumble away, leaving nothing behind but the quiet silence of the void. He wasn't sure if he was alive or dead. He wasn't sure if any of this was real. All he knew was that the darkness was gone, and he was free. But freedom came at a cost. Derek had escaped the grasp of the shadows, but in doing so, he had lost something more. He had lost a part of himself, a part that could never be recovered. As the void faded away, Derek was left standing in a place that felt unfamiliar, isolated. The nightmare was over, but the scars remained. And somewhere, deep within the shadows, something was waiting. The eternal wait. Derek's world was no longer the same. The air felt heavier now, thick with an unsettling quiet. He stood in what seemed like an endless, empty field, the landscape stretching out in all directions, barren and lifeless. There were no sounds here, no birds, no wind. Just the oppressive weight of silence. He could barely make out the horizon, but it didn't matter. Nothing here seemed real. Everything felt like a faded memory, slipping away just beyond his grasp. He closed his eyes, hoping for a moment of peace, but all that came was the memory of the figure's eyes. Those hollow, cold eyes that had haunted him from the very beginning. It was as though they were etched into his mind, unshakable and unforgiving. Derek didn't know what was worse, the fear of being consumed by the darkness, or the crushing weight of knowing that it had left its mark on him. But I'm free, he reminded himself, trying to steady his racing thoughts. It's over. I survived. He wished he could believe it, but something gnawed at him from within. The The darkness hadn't just been a force, it had been a part of him. It had twisted his soul, left a scar so deep that it would never fully heal. Derek wasn't sure what that scar meant for him. What would he become now? Could he ever truly escape the aftermath of this experience? The memories of his past, his normal life, felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. The more he thought about them, the further they slipped away. His mind was clouded, consumed by an ever-growing sense of dread. It was as if the very act of surviving had broken him in some way, leaving him in an eternal limbo. His body might have escaped the darkness, but his soul was forever marked. Suddenly, Derek felt a familiar sensation, something cold brushing against the back of his neck. It wasn't wind. It wasn't the chill of the environment. It was a presence, something that had never fully left. His skin crawled as his breath caught in his throat. He didn't want to look back, but some force, some invisible pull, compelled him to turn. When he did, the ground beneath him cracked again, and there it was, the figure. It was standing still in the distance, its long, skeletal fingers curling as if beckoning him. Its form shimmered like a mirage, but Derek knew it wasn't an illusion. The darkness had found him again. "You can't run from me, Derek," the figure's voice echoed, distant but piercing. It wasn't a voice. It was a command, an unavoidable truth. "You've been marked. No matter where you go, no matter how far you try to run, I will always be here. You can never escape." Derek's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know how, but it was happening again. The nightmare was repeating itself, drawing him back into its endless grip. This time, he wasn't sure he could fight it. There was nothing left to fight with, no strength, no willpower. The energy drained from his body, his mind growing heavier with every step he took toward the figure. The shadows around him stretched longer, moving like tendrils, closing in around him. No matter how fast he ran, they would always catch up. They would always be there. He was trapped in an endless cycle, always running, never truly escaping. "You think you've won," the figure continued, its voice now almost compassionate. "But the truth is, Derek, you were never free. You were always mine." A cold shiver ran down his spine. His mind screamed at him to resist, but his body refused to obey. He wanted to run, to scream, to do something, anything, but all he could do was stand there, paralyzed by fear. The figure's presence loomed closer, its outline shifting in the fading light. Derek could see the shape of it more clearly now, its face twisted, almost human, yet so wrong. The hollow eyes stared straight into his soul, as if reading every hidden fear, every dark secret he had buried within. It knew him better than he knew himself. "There is no escape from the truth," the figure said softly, its voice dripping with a twisted sweetness. "You will never be free. The darkness is your fate, Derek. It always has been." Tears welled up in Derek's eyes, but he didn't wipe them away. His entire being trembled with the realization that there was no victory. No end. No final escape. This wasn't just a nightmare. This was his life now. A never-ending cycle of fear and torment. His struggle had only delayed the inevitable. The darkness had already claimed him, body, mind, and soul. And as Derek stood there, facing the figure once more, he finally understood. There was no running. There was no fighting. All he could do now was wait. Wait for the darkness to consume him completely. Forever. The hollow whisper. Derek didn't know how much longer he could stand there, the oppressive silence smothering every last breath he took. His body felt like it had been turned to stone, his limbs stiff and unyielding, as though the very weight of his existence had been drained from him. But still, he couldn't look away. The figure was still there, standing before him, patient, unhurried, its hollow eyes locked onto his very soul. Why won't it end? Derek thought, his mind clouded with fear and desperation. He had fought, he had struggled, and yet it had all been for nothing. He had thought that if he escaped the darkness once, he could escape forever. But now, in the presence of this unyielding force, he realized just how wrong he was. The air around him seemed to grow colder still, each breath feeling sharper, as though the chill was seeping into his bones. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, its eyes never leaving Derek's, an eerie silence hanging between them. And then finally it spoke again. "You are the last one, Derek." The figure's voice was low and haunting, each word dripping with an unnatural calm. "The last to remain. The others, they've all been consumed, but you? You've always been mine." Derek's heart thudded painfully against his chest. His mind reeled. Consumed? The others? What was it talking about? His eyes darted around, but the world around him remained unchanged. The same endless expanse. The same desolate emptiness. It was as if everything he had known, everything he had fought for, had been erased, reduced to nothing more than a fading dream. "I don't understand," Derek whispered, his voice trembling. He couldn't contain the desperation in his tone. "What do you mean? Why me? Why am I the last?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as if amused by his confusion. It took a slow step forward, and Derek instinctively took a step back, his body reacting on its own. But it didn't matter. No matter how far he moved, the figure followed, its presence growing stronger, more suffocating. Because, it said, its voice now colder, sharper, "You were always destined for this. You were always going to be the one to face me, to face the end." The words hung in the air, and Derek felt a chill run down his spine. The end. It felt so final, so inevitable, as though this was something he couldn't avoid, no matter how much he tried. He was already trapped, caught in the web of its lies, and he had never even known it. "But I fought," Derek whispered, his voice barely audible. "I fought to survive. I didn't give up." The figure's lips curled into a twisted smile, a look of mockery painted across its hollow face. "Fighting doesn't matter, Derek. You can't fight fate. You can't fight what's been set in motion from the moment you stepped into my world." The figure stepped even closer, its shadow falling over Derek like a blanket of darkness, pressing in on him from all sides. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The weight of its presence was unbearable, suffocating him with its cold, oppressive power. "You didn't just enter my world, Derek," the figure continued, its voice now a whisper in his ear. "You were always a part of it. You've always belonged to me." Derek gasped for air, his mind spinning as he tried to make sense of its words. How could this be? He had been ordinary. Just an ordinary man, living an ordinary life. How could he have been part of this nightmare all along? The figure reached out slowly, its long, skeletal fingers brushing against Derek's cheek, cold as ice. His body shuddered in response, but he couldn't pull away. There was nowhere to go. Nowhere to run. "You will understand in time," the figure murmured. "In time, you will see that there was never any escape. That the darkness was always inside you. And now it's too late." Derek felt his knees buckle beneath him, his legs no longer able to hold him up. The weight of the figure's words crushed him, breaking what little resolve he had left. His mind was unraveling, the threads of his sanity coming apart with each passing second. He had fought. He had struggled. But what had it all been for? What was the point of any of it? As Derek's world continued to fall apart around him, the figure's words echoed in his mind, haunting him. "You're mine. You always have been." And with those final words, Derek felt the darkness rush in, consuming everything. His vision blurred, and the world around him began to collapse, the edges of reality distorting as the figure's form dissolved into the shadows. He had fought to survive. But now there was nothing left to fight. The hollow realm. Derek's world had crumbled. The endless field of silence, the chilling presence of the figure, and the words that pierced through his very soul. All of it had dissolved into nothing. For a brief moment, there was nothing but darkness, an all-consuming void where time no longer existed. He couldn't even feel his own body anymore. He was just there, lost in the emptiness. But then a flicker of light. It was faint at first, like the smallest spark of a dying star. A pale glow surrounded him, and he felt himself slowly being pulled toward it. His limbs, once heavy and stiff, began to move again, though weakly, as though he were learning to walk once more. The light grew brighter, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Derek felt a sense of direction. He couldn't see clearly yet, but the pull was undeniable. Something was calling to him, something far beyond the reach of the figure that had tormented him. He had to reach it. As he stumbled forward, the light began to reveal itself, a soft, shimmering glow that reminded him of home. The warmth of a fire, the feeling of safety. But it didn't feel right. There was something off about it. The more he walked toward it, the more his heart pounded, warning him that this might not be the salvation he thought it was. He took a step closer. The light flickered again, growing sharper this time. It wasn't the comforting glow he had hoped for. It was colder, harsher. It was like staring into a broken mirror, one that reflected his worst fears, his darkest thoughts. It didn't look like the light at all. It was just an illusion. And then a voice. "Why did you return, Derek?" The voice was familiar, like an echo of something he had already heard. He froze, his heart stopping for a second. The voice came from all directions at once, soft, soothing, and terrifying all the same. It was the figure again. "I thought you understood," the voice continued. "There is no escape." There is nowhere to run. The darkness has already claimed you. Derek's body tensed, and he instinctively turned around, but there was nothing there. The figure wasn't in sight, yet he could feel it. It was in the air, in his thoughts, in his very being. There was no hiding from it now. You can't change what's been done. The voice was closer now, as if it had been right beside him the entire time, whispering in his ear. You will never be free, Derek. This is your fate. Your fate to wander in the darkness forever. Derek fell to his knees, his hands trembling as they hit the cold, invisible ground. His thoughts were unraveling again, slipping like sand through his fingers. How could he fight this? How could he have been so foolish to think that he could? I'm not giving up, Derek whispered, though the words felt hollow in his throat. I won't let you win. For a moment there was silence. The kind of silence that pressed in from all sides, heavy and thick. And then the voice laughed, a low, mocking sound that sent chills through Derek's spine. You still don't understand, do you? The voice taunted. You never had a choice. I've already won. You are mine. Derek's eyes blurred with tears, his mind breaking under the weight of those words. The figure had always been there, hadn't it? In the background, in the shadows, pulling the strings from the moment he had set foot in that cursed place. It had been waiting for him, watching, waiting for the moment when he would finally understand. You're part of the darkness, Derek. The voice was almost gentle now, a sickly sweet comfort. Always have been. And now you belong to me. His vision began to fade again, the world around him distorting, turning into a nightmarish blur of shadows and light. The darkness crept in from the edges of his sight, swallowing the little light that remained. It was too much to bear. He was losing himself, sinking deeper into the void with each passing second. And then he heard something else. Something different. A soft whisper. Derek. It was a familiar voice, one he hadn't heard in what felt like forever. His mother's voice. Derek, you must listen. The whisper was urgent, desperate. You are stronger than this. You can fight. You can still save yourself. But the words were fading, growing distant, like a memory slipping away. Derek tried to call out, to reach for that voice, but it was gone before he could react. And all that remained was the dark, the hollow space that was slowly consuming him. The figure's presence grew stronger once more, its cold, malevolent energy wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. There was no escaping it now. There never had been. You will never escape, Derek. The figure's voice was everywhere now, filling the air, the space, the very essence of his being. Derek could feel it closing in around him, tightening its grip until there was no more room to breathe. He was drowning in it, in its cold, relentless power. And he knew deep down that he was lost. This was it. The end. Derek had become nothing more than a shadow, a flicker of a forgotten memory in the face of the eternal darkness. The shattered truth. Derek was lost, trapped in the emptiness, consumed by the relentless darkness. The voice of the figure echoed in his mind, its words repeating over and over, like a chant that never ended. You will never escape, Derek. You are mine. The cold air around him felt suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides. He couldn't breathe. His chest ached, his heart pounding as if it were trying to break free from the grip of whatever this darkness was. He couldn't see, couldn't move, couldn't think. Is this how it ends? He wondered in his final moments of clarity. Was this the fate that awaited him? To be swallowed whole by the void? But just when Derek thought he could bear it no longer, a flicker of light, so faint it seemed impossible, appeared before him. It was like the tiniest star in an ocean of blackness. For a moment, it was all he could focus on. The light wasn't like the illusions before. It wasn't cold or distant. It was warm, almost familiar. It called to him, drawing him in with an unseen force. Derek's body responded without hesitation. He reached out with trembling hands, desperate for a connection, for anything that could pull him from the endless spiral. As his fingertips brushed the light, everything shifted. The darkness trembled, as if it was afraid of what was to come. The oppressive weight that had crushed him for so long began to loosen, just a little, and he felt something else stir within him. Something deep inside, buried beneath the fear and the pain. It was hope. A faint, fragile hope. The light grew brighter, and Derek's mind raced. Could it really be true? Could there be an end to this suffering? Was there a way to escape? Derek, a voice called out, softer now, not the cold, mocking voice of the figure, but a voice he recognized. Derek, you are stronger than you know. It was his mother's voice again, clear and strong, cutting through the darkness like a blade. The light grew more intense, and with it, Derek felt his body come alive. His limbs, once heavy and lifeless, began to move again. His chest rose and fell with each breath, no longer shallow and constricted by fear. He had been lost. He had been consumed by the darkness. But now he was fighting back. The figure's voice screamed in fury, its words breaking through the calm like thunder. "No," it shrieked. "You cannot escape. You cannot fight me." But Derek wasn't listening anymore. He was focused on the light, on the voice, on the strength that was beginning to surge within him. "I am not yours," he whispered fiercely, his voice filled with conviction. "I am not your prey." The figure screamed again, its form flickering in and out of existence, growing weaker, as if the light was pushing it back, driving it away. The darkness that had once felt impenetrable was now retreating, and Derek could feel himself rising out of it. The pull of the void was weakening, the oppressive weight lifting from his shoulders. But just as Derek thought he might escape, just as he thought he might be free, a cold hand grasped his shoulder. He froze. The figure had returned, not in the form of the shadow he had known, but in a new, more terrifying form. It was no longer distant. It was right there, behind him, its cold breath on his neck, its voice now an unholy whisper. "You think you can escape me, Derek?" The voice was laced with venom. "You think you have a choice? You were never meant to be free." Derek's body went rigid, but he didn't look back. He couldn't. If he did, he knew it would be the end. He had come too far, fought too hard to let the figure pull him back into its grasp. He was shaking, but not from fear. He was shaking with the realization of what he had to do. With a final, desperate breath, Derek focused on the light, on the warmth that had slowly been growing inside him. He drew it up from deep within, fueling it with everything he had left. The memory of his mother's voice, the strength of his will, and the hope that had been reignited. And then he did it. He turned, facing the figure head-on, his body glowing with the light that now filled every part of him. "This ends now," Derek shouted, his voice echoing through the void. The figure shrieked, recoiling as if the very presence of the light burned it. It writhed and twisted, its form flickering as it fought to maintain its shape. But Derek didn't hesitate. With every ounce of strength he could muster, he pressed forward, the light blazing around him, consuming everything in its path. For a moment, everything went white. And then there was silence. The final revelation. The silence was deafening. For a long, endless moment, Derek felt as though he had been suspended in time, floating in a vast, empty space where nothing could touch him. There were no shadows, no whispers, no oppressive darkness. It was just still. Slowly, Derek opened his eyes. His surroundings were unfamiliar, yet strangely comforting. He was standing in a place that resembled the world he had once known, but everything was washed in a soft, golden light. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling in harmony with the sounds of distant birds. It was peaceful, too peaceful. His heart thudded in his chest, the weight of what had just happened settling over him. Had it all been a dream? Had he truly escaped, or was this just another illusion? He wasn't sure, but he felt the pull of something familiar. "Derek." He froze. The voice was gentle but commanding, like the calm before a storm. He turned, and there she was, his mother. Her figure stood before him, bathed in the same soft light, her smile kind and warm. "You're free, Derek," she said softly, her voice full of love and sorrow. "But you must understand something." Derek took a step forward, his legs weak, his mind spinning. What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Am I really free? Was it all real?" His mother's smile faded just slightly, and she stepped closer. There was a sadness in her eyes that made Derek's heart ache. "You were never meant to be trapped. The darkness, the figure, it was all a part of your journey. It was never about escaping, Derek. It was about confronting what lay inside you." Derek's throat tightened as he tried to process her words. His journey, the horrors he had faced, the figure that had tormented him, it had all felt so real, so consuming. "What do you mean? I don't understand." His mother placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch soft and grounding. "The darkness was a reflection of your fears, your regrets. The figure was an embodiment of your guilt, your pain. It was always with you, Derek, because it came from you. But now you have the power to release it, to let it go." Derek's eyes widened. "You mean the figure wasn't real? It wasn't something outside of me." The realization hit him like a wave. All this time, he had been fighting something that wasn't a monster in the shadows. It had been a part of him, born from his own inner turmoil. "Yes," his mother nodded, her voice growing softer. "You created it. And now you can let it go. You have the strength to heal, to move forward." Derek's chest tightened as he let her words sink in. All the pain, all the fear, it had been his own creation. He had allowed it to consume him, to define him, because he hadn't known how to face it. But now, standing before his mother, in this place of peace, he realized that he could let it go. He could release the darkness, once and for all. But how? He asked, his voice barely audible. How do I let it go? By forgiving yourself, she whispered. By facing the truth that you are not the mistakes you've made. You are not your regrets. You are more than the darkness inside you. Derek closed his eyes, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had carried so much guilt, so many unresolved feelings for so long. The fear, the anger. It had been easier to hide from it, to let it fester inside him. But now, with his mother's guidance, he understood. He had the power to change, to release the darkness that had controlled him for so long. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Derek took a deep breath. He exhaled slowly, letting go of the tension that had built up in his body. As he did, he felt the weight lifting off his shoulders, the suffocating pressure that had been with him for so long slowly fading away. And then a strange thing happened. The light around him began to shift, to change. The soft golden glow grew brighter, more intense, until it felt like it was enveloping him completely. But instead of fear, he felt calm. He felt peace. You are free, Derek, his mother's voice echoed one last time, soft and fading. The light surrounded him, growing brighter and brighter, until there was nothing but brilliance. And then, in a flash, it was gone. Derek opened his eyes again. He was no longer in the strange world he had been trapped in. He was back in the real world, standing alone in the darkness of the night. The air was cold, the ground beneath him hard. But he was awake. He was alive. And he was free. For the first time in what felt like forever, Derek felt a sense of peace. The figure was gone. The darkness was gone. All that remained was him, standing alone in the quiet, with nothing but his own thoughts. He was no longer bound by the fears and guilt that had held him captive for so long. He had faced his inner demons, let them go, and come out stronger on the end story. Please subscribe to my channel Night Howl.